Hello, I'm Lorna from the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. This seminar is a part of a series about doing things differently, looking at society, politics and economics during and after the COVID-19 crisis. Today we are discussing the transformation of cities that we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. Traffic has lulled. Until very recently, high streets were virtually empty, new temporary cycleways have been created, and green spaces have become an increasingly vital part of people's active and social lifestyles. The changes the pandemic has made to life and work in cities is huge and offers a glimpse at a possible alternative future. Could this be an opportunity for cities to be reinvented? And if so, how would we even begin to go about doing that? I've got a fantastic panel of speakers to discuss today's topic, who are now going to introduce themselves. So, Razieh, can I take it over to you?
Hi, I'm Dr. Razieh Zandieh, lecturer in urban design and planning at the School of Environment, Education and Development at the University of Manchester.
Thank you, Razieh. And Richard?
Hi, my name is Richard Kingston. I'm a Professor of Urban Planning and Geographic Information Science in the same school as Razieh, and I develop web-based decision support systems.
Thanks, Richard. And I've got Jonathan.
Yeah, so my name is Jonathan Pinkse. I'm Professor of Strategy, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and also the Director of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research, both at the Alliance Manchester Business School.
Fantastic. And Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Ravitz. I'm in the School of Environment and Development. I lead on future-proof cities for the Manchester Urban Institute, and I study systems of deeper complexity and collective intelligence.
Thank you very much, Joe. So there is so much that we could talk about today, but I want to begin by looking at the importance of green spaces in city infrastructures, because that's something that's been thrown into sharp relief during the lockdown. So I wondered whether we could start with you, Razieh, talking about, can you tell us some of the reasons why you think green space is so vital in cities and what you think needs to change?
Thank you, Lorna. We know that green space is a key element in the city, and I think COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown highlighted the necessity of equity of access to green spaces in the city. The lockdown was a strategy that helped helped to save people from COVID-19 and the contagious disease, but it could have some negative impacts on people's mental and physical health. During the lockdown, we have heard through the news about mental health, such as stress due to financial issues, gender violence, or simply staying at home and getting bored. And in terms of physical health, well, there are some issues like obesity and overweight during the lockdown. We stay home and we are less active. So accordingly, during the lockdown, people were allowed to go outside home once a day for necessity purposes like doing physical activity. And we see that many people go to green spaces and use the green space, such as parks. Several studies have shown that green spaces, such as parks, have many significant benefits for mental and physical health, such as stress reduction and restoration and encouraging physical activities. During the lockdown, we saw thousands of people went to green spaces, and sometimes density of users were too high in some green spaces. That was threatening the physical distances between people. This behavior highlighted the necessity of access to green spaces during the lockdown. However, distribution of green spaces is not equal everywhere in all cities or in the city. Usually it is unequal. People who are living in compact areas of the city, such as city centers or in high deprivation areas, they have limited access to green spaces. And it is worse for those who are living in flats and they don't have access to gardens. So COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown highlighted this issue in the cities, and we realized that more than ever, actually more than before, we realized that we should provide equity of access to green spaces for everyone. It was a wake-up call for us to provide this access, this equal access to green spaces. So I think we need to create more green spaces in the cities. We can convert car parks and lost spaces into green spaces. I think we need to create more green streets and green corridors especially in compact areas of the city where the land is scarce or is expensive or is not available. We don't have enough space to create green spaces, so we can create green streets and green networks. And by having green spaces and green network together, we can have green spaces and green corridors together, we can have a green network. And the green network covers the larger area, or I can say the wider area in the city. So it can provide a more equal access to green spaces, and also because it is wider in the city, people have more access to green spaces. They are distributed in wider areas in the city, so it may reduce the issue of density in specific green spaces that we are facing now. So yeah, I think this issue is really highlighted, and we need to think about these areas in the city, the compact areas and high deprivation areas, and limited access to green spaces.
I think that that really fits into the other thing that I've been thinking about as well during the pandemic, that the way that people are moving in cities is changing as well, and that green space, yeah, people are exercising a lot more and meeting friends outdoors, but that a lot of that is changing because of the way that, as I said, people move around the cities, with many larger cities putting temporary measures in place for people allowed to be able to walk and cycle more easily. And, you know, we've seen in Manchester, Deansgate has been closed off so that it's become a cycleway. And there is the Safe Streets, Safe Lives campaign that's been brought in with £5 million of emergency funding to help councils put measures in place. So that kind of brings me on to the next thing that I wanted to speak about. Richard, can you talk us through a few of the changes that we're seeing in terms of transport and movement, and the ways in which we think it could alter the way we commute and use transport in cities? What do you think is possible?
So what I'm going to show you now is some of the recent data. So what we can see here is recent data that Google have been collecting from people who have an Android phone, and if they've got their location history turned on. This is data for Greater Manchester, and we can see up to the 7th of June, so this is pretty recent. So this is over lockdown, how we've changed, or certainly people with Android phones, how they've changed their behaviour. And this is compared with a baseline from the 3rd to the 6th of February, so kind of a 3-week, nearly a month before lockdown. And what we can see there is a lot of things, like we've been a huge drop in people going retail shopping and even access to supermarkets. And where we've seen increases is residential. Obviously, people are staying at home, so there's been a 10% increase of people being at home, which is not surprising. But we can see there a 27% drop in people being at their place of work, and a huge decrease in the use of public transport. Train services have been limited, and so have bus services and the tram service across Manchester. But what's interesting, from building on what Razieh has just said, is look in the top right there, 23% increase in the use of parks. And we see, particularly towards the latter part of sort of end of May, early June, when we saw that much warmer weather, even more people going out into parks. So we've seen a change in what people are doing in terms of their day-to-day behaviour over the last couple of months. But what I also look at is how people commute over time, and this is some analysis we did about 2 years ago on looking at the census data of where people travel. We've done this for the whole of England and Wales. You can go onto this website, there's an interactive tool there, you can click on any location, you can see how people come in and out of the city. And the different colours there shows different types of commuters based on here. So the blue column here are what we call consumer services, people who work in shops. They predominantly travel to work by bus. And what we've got here, this column here, which is the most number of commuters, these are what people who travel to work by sustainable modes. So they tend to travel to work by train, bus and bike. And in 2011, 14,000 people commuted into, this is people commuting into the very centre of Manchester, with 14,000 people travelling in, and 7,500 in another category, this green column at the end, who travel further distances. You can see those lines on the maps. This is where they're traveling, on the outer parts of the map. That's where they live and they're traveling in. 7,500 people who are in a higher paid senior roles, but also are more likely to travel by train. Now, the reason why this is interesting at the moment is that as we start to ease lockdown, if these people are going to have to come back into work, how are they going to do that? If we've only done a bit at the moment, you can only allow 20% capacity on buses and trains. So this creates a real problem in terms of how are people going to get to work if that's what we end up having to do. So because of that, we have to look at alternatives. And also, I think what we need to be aware of is that not everyone works in the city centre. So this is people commuting in to the very central area of the city. But let's look at the same analysis if we look at Trafford Park. So the Trafford Park and Trafford Centre. Just look at what that previous bar chart looked at. The resolution's a bit different. But look at the blue column, the first column on the right. In the city centre, 2,500 people who commute into consumer services. But look at the Trafford Centre. That column there, it might be difficult to see, but there's 14,539 people who work in consumer services. Not surprising because it's a Trafford Centre, lots of retail there. But again, these people are likely to travel by public transport into that area. So again, we need to think about not just the city centre, but other areas. There's a lot of jobs at Manchester Airport, at Airport City. What about people who live in Bolton, Rochdale, and the commutes into those? So in a response to that, what Greater Manchester have been doing is looking at using some funding from central government to put up pop-up cycle lanes. And these are kind of giving you the times it would take to cycle from some of the outlying areas into the centre of Manchester. But the problem with this is it assumes that everyone's working in the city centre, and sometimes we have to think about not everyone works in the city centre. People need to move to other places as well. I think we also, while we can identify these quick wins, having these temporary cycle lanes in there, we also need to think about how we can use this to achieve what we call a longer-term modal shift. How do we get people out of their cars onto public transport, but also potentially out onto bicycles as well. One problem, though, when we do have a slight problem here in Manchester, is that here's showing you the potential for this cycling. We do know at the moment the city of Manchester, one of 10 districts, are not wanting to put this temporary cycling infrastructure. They want to look at a longer-term solution. So at the moment, we can have this problem where you can cycle, and we know from what people have been telling us that people are cycling to the boundary of the city of Manchester, and suddenly this cycle infrastructure disappears. I think we also need to think about the future. If this comes back again, there's all kinds of new types of mobility. Electric scooters, people are using them. They're not actually yet legal in the UK. We've seen an increase, believe it or not, in tricycles. Elderly people are buying tricycles. And then we've got a whole new set of mobility around autonomous vehicles, driverless cars. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions around different modes of transportation that we've not thought about yet, that go beyond just the bicycle and maybe e-bikes and these kind of electric sort of mopeds as well. So lots of things to think about in terms of what commuters could be doing, how they might shift, and how we provide alternatives that are beyond sort of the usual public transport modes, particularly if we're only operating those at a 20% capacity.
Absolutely, yeah. And so if we're thinking about changing the way in which we're moving around cities, that obviously could have a real environmental impact. There's going to be different consequences from that. So I wondered whether, Jonathan, you could talk a little bit about the potential environmental consequences if we start to make these changes in the way in which we commute, the way we socialise, and the way that we exercise in cities.
Yes, thank you. There are all kinds of consequences, of course. One of the major things people think about when they think about environmental impact nowadays is climate change. So yes, if we will no longer use the car and start using bicycles, that will really be beneficial for climate change. But for a city perspective, that's probably not even the main reason. It is a lot more about local pollution. One of the main problems right now for people that might want to use the bike is that because of the many cars, it's not very healthy to cycle because you actually get a lot of negative environmental impact yourself. So that's where the balance is really difficult to get. As you can hear, I'm from the Netherlands originally. I'm from Amsterdam, and that is one of those cities that is now very often being seen together with Copenhagen as how to do it for the future. Yes, we Dutchies, we cycle a lot, but it is a cultural thing as well. We've been doing that for decades, and it's not really necessarily for environmental reasons. So people don't just change their commuting behavior for environmental reasons. It's really because it is easier. But why is it easier? Because the government has taken many steps to make it very difficult. You basically can't drive your car anywhere you want in Amsterdam. It's close to impossible. And that's why the bike is just way more convenient. It's faster. You don't get stuck in traffic and so forth. So it's really a cultural issue as well. So I have a lot of conversations with my colleagues who think I'm crazy because I cycle always. I ask them, why are you not using the bicycle? And then they will indeed mention, well, I don't think it's very healthy right now doing that because of the many cars. It's like, yeah, but you're partly contributing to that with your own behavior. But the main thing they keep saying is it's not safe. They worry about safety. So that's where you really need, indeed, all these kind of interventions that my colleagues just have been talking about. You need separate bicycle lanes and really done in a very good manner. Because right now, I must say some of the ones, if you look at Oxford Road, it's not perfect. Let's put it like that. There are so many instances where cars can still cut into the bicycle lane, and that is then exactly when you get all kinds of accidents and why people don't want to do this. So in the end, it is a cultural change. Another argument I hear very often is the weather. Yes, but it always rains. I have to admit that one of the most popular apps in the Netherlands is one that is showing the showers, so you can get your timing right. That would definitely work here as well. I have to say Amsterdam is not a tropical climate at all. You get a lot of rain there as well. And once you start using alternative forms like biking, you figure out it's not that bad. But hey, maybe that's my cultural background that I'm not too bothered about that. On the other hand, typical Brits don't seem to be bothered by rain at all. You can't, by looking at people, you won't really know whether it rains or not because they're not necessarily adjusting to that. So for me, it is a huge benefit, of course, if we all start banning cars and it becomes a safe environment, because then you really work on reducing local pollution levels, but also the health benefits are then becoming real because you're no longer suffering from the other cars that are around you. And then doing more exercise is a natural thing because you just use it for commuting. There are huge health benefits, of course. But in the short term, I'm really worried. I myself now live in Lancaster, so I have to take the train. Well, that's the first problem. If I take the car, it was already always the problem that I would get stuck at Bolton. I tried it 3 times, so it took me about 40 minutes to get to Bolton, and it would take me another 1.5 hours to get to the university. So that was not really convenient. If those people that joined me in the train are now going for the car as well, this problem will only become worse. So you really need to think about kind of how do you get to the edge of Greater Manchester, and then indeed what Richard just showed, what are alternatives to do that last part of getting to work, because that is something that is really difficult right now in Manchester. And that is a long-term investment, so that should not be a response just now because of the COVID-19 crisis. That should be a response to very deep problems that Greater Manchester has in terms of mobility. And yeah, I think one of the main solutions is good old regulation. You should just not be allowed. I believe my employer in Amsterdam did not allow people to park their car on the premises if they lived in the city itself, because they said there's no point using your car. So you just couldn't park your car. And that worked beautifully because then people see no alternative than using either the bicycle or the tram system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as you said, there's so much to think about to get it all to work together. And that's where I come unstuck. I've been thinking, oh, we could change this, and what about this? This is an opportunity for us to be looking at a completely different future. And that's just from the few things that we've touched upon today. But so if we wanted to go about making these changes, or thinking about the way that we change the way, as you said, the way that we're moving and the way that we're commuting, then how do we go about it? How do we turn this crisis into an opportunity? It's such a big thing to think about. And that's why I kind of wanted to ask you, Joe, are you able to provide any ideas as where you think that we could begin with some of these changes that we've been talking about?
Well, I could talk for 2 or 3 hours just to get started, but just to kind of sum up, this is something I've been working on myself. I'm just sharing, is that coming through? Okay. So pandemic 3.0. 1.0 was maybe the Black Death or the Great Plague, you know, and then 2.0 was when, we know how to build hospitals now. 3.0 is where the whole of society starts to work together. So instead of flailing around in bits and crisis and power games and so on, we actually get our act together. So this is my great hope. This current series kicked off, when the pandemic kicked off, and my futures group started to look at alternative futures, one where the pandemic was solved, one when it was ongoing, and then also futures where society wanted to just bounce back to exactly how it was before, or it wanted to make a transition into some new state. So then we've got a space of possibilities. We can start to chart out the possibilities of transition, and we solve the pandemic, everything's great, people party in their neighborhoods, or maybe we bounce back, but the pandemic continues. Maybe we're actually fast falling into this space. A lot of people just want to get back to normal, and you can see with the current shopping craze, retail therapy, great. But at the same time, there is this distinct possibility that really this pandemic is not going to go away. It's resurging already in New Zealand, China, and so on. So maybe we have to get used to a rather different way of life. And here you see a little cartoon of, you know, bubbles, and you take your dog, or even the cyclist, have to wear protective gear. That would be a thing. So then I draw on things that I've worked on over the years in terms of what we call visual foresight. Here's an image which tries to show how the city is falling to bits, and it's continuously being remade by different players in the game. And you see the scientists, you see the leaders, political leaders, entrepreneurs like Bezos, we see the virus itself. They just want to reproduce. Is that a problem? But we also see communities, you know, putting up the bridge, flying their flag. Yes, this is our place, you know, as in the riots or confrontation last weekend. Big cultural problems coming to the fore, just unlocked maybe by the virus thing, but exacerbated and multiplied up possibly. So we devised a way of having a game, and this is where basically we track the different players in a situation, anyone from a beggar to a billionaire, and in between, obviously. We sketch a kind of game which best shows what they are doing. And in this case, you can see a game of Monopoly. If anyone used to play Monopoly as kids, well, this is a slightly more colourful version, as you can see. But the principle is the same. You grab what you can, the rich take, the poor give, the poor are moved around, and so on and so on. And it's a kind of massive game of chance and skill and a certain state of mind. So we track the results with this game, and then we experiment with game changes. What if we change the rules or change the board? Would it work better for more people? Would it suit the higher goals of sustainability or safety and so on? And if that looks like a good idea, then we explore the pathways to them. And of course, the first thing is to identify the players. Who are these players? Well, some people, they design cities, they own cities. Some people just live in cities, some work there. And then there are many more differences within that. So then we say, okay, what if we take that board and play out what we can see in the city around us right now? I'm not saying this is good, this is what's happening. The city is being divided into zones. High value, high safety. I'm very lucky to live in a nice place. Low value, high safety. Maybe transitional zones, quarantine hostels. This is already happening in many countries. High value and low safety. Old people's homes. People go in there, they don't come out again, except in a box. Very sad. Low value and low safety. This is where the workers live. The bus drivers, the nurses, dense mass housing. They have no choice to get the bus or the tube to work, and their mortality is at risk. And then we look at where people work: consumer services, knowledge production, personal service. And the point is to explore this in a visual form. We then can start to experiment with different ways to do it. Another game-changing question is to say, shall we just change our habits and our lifestyle? It could be better than crashing the entire economy if everyone wears hazmat suits when they travel, or everyone has a stock of 100 disposable gloves per day, biodegradable of course, or hands-free retail. Is this possible? The drone will put the thing in your basket, and so on. So all these things are possible. And then we start to say, wait a minute, could we change the actual pattern? Because at the moment, we have thousands of years of history of cities based on dense mixing of people. The people come together, they have meetings, they have meals, they work together, and so on. All this is kind of up in the air. Maybe we have to talk about new ideas: disturbanism, social not work if people are not working, the Zoomiversity, obviously, and so on. So, and then we say, okay, who are the winners and losers out of this round so far? Winners, people in nice places, big construction firms, maybe. Losers, ordinary people in high density housing, and also cities which sprawl and stagnate and cannot get their act together. So there's a lot more to be said, but we could say, okay, let's stand back a minute, see what people are playing. And here is one kind of game. People say, okay, how do we raise our share value? How do we get through this? And this is actually the Dominic Cummings game. I mean, no offense to our glorious leader here, but his game is really quite controversial once you think it through, because it's all heading in the direction of big data, which will organize your life. If you're a high-risk person in a low-value place, sorry, you may be dispensable. So we then have to ask another kind of question. What would it take to transform? And well, it's a long story, but we can say roughly, here are ways to go about it. And this is in my current book, actually, so I can refer you to that. But we look for ways in which humans can unleash their potential. They can have deliberative inquiry. They can have citizens' assemblies. They can have skeptical appreciation, and so on. And then we look for spaces where this can actually happen. Innovation spaces, co-learning, physical space, financial space, and so on. Experimental spaces. We have to find the space to make experiments. Now, what we've seen in the last couple of months is an incredible rate of experimentation in communities, networks, neighborhoods, shopping, restaurants that deliver, and so on and so on. And the big fear is, all that will be just pushed to the side, we'll bounce back to some kind of half normal, and life will lurch from crisis to crisis. And we know that the UK is already world beater in, the world's highest excess death rate, the world's biggest hit to any developed economy. So there's a lot to play for. So I'll leave it there, but you get a sort of flavour of the way that our creative thinking is working on these issues and looking for ways to turn crisis into transformation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joe. That's been really interesting to look at and start thinking about. And I think today, what this has made me realise is that we have barely scratched the surface. And I think for the viewers watching this, it's just given us a little bit of food for thought about where these discussions are going to go over the next couple of months, what governments need to be thinking about and what we need to take into consideration. So if you're watching this and you have any other questions for our panelists, we are going to be sharing their social media handles, and if you want to use the hashtag #UOM Humanities, we're going to make sure these get picked up so the conversation can be continued. and you can continue to start thinking about what we've started here. So thank you so much for watching us today and engaging with doing things differently. It's been great to be here.